Have you ever felt like you spent your whole life trying to be seen by someone who never really looked at you? This wound is more common than you might think, but it's rarely acknowledged. Because unlike moms, fathers often fail silently. He was there, but his gaze never really landed. And growing up without that gaze means growing up constantly trying to prove your worth. Through achievement, through toughness, through silence. You learn to endure, but deep down, you're still waiting for that recognition. Carl Jung was one of the first to show that a father's absence goes beyond your personal story. It touches something deeper. In the psyche, the father represents the axis of authority, the drive to engage with the world, the source of validation. When that figure fails, through absence, abandonment, coldness, or relentless pressure, something breaks inside the child. It's not just love that's missing, it's the sense of self-worth. Today, I want to help you recognize this emotional wound and give you a practical way to begin healing it. And at the end of this video, I'll challenge you with something powerful. It's simple, but it might just help you break free from the grip of a presence that was never fully there. From the earliest years, a child's psyche builds inner images to make sense of the world. Jung called these images archetypes, primordial templates that shape our emotional experience even before we can speak. Among them, one of the most foundational is the archetype of the father. At the symbolic level, the father is more than a man. He represents the psychic force that helps us break away from the emotional fusion with the mother and begin the journey of individuation. That is, becoming who we truly are. It's the energy that separates, that cuts the invisible cord of emotional dependence, that places a child before life with courage and direction. Where the mother is seen as the source of love, nurture, and affection, the father stands for strength, guidance, and protection. The mother nurtures the heart. The father prepares you for the world, and maybe that's why the father wound is so much quieter, and at the same time, more devastating. Because while the mother's absence shows up as emotional hunger, the father's absence shows up as a fractured foundation, a lack of direction, a missing validation that quietly eats away from the inside. If you're curious about how the mother wound plays out in your life, we've got a full video on that here on the channel. It's honestly one of the most eye-opening ones we've ever made. We get messages every day from people saying it was the first time they really felt seen. If that resonates, the link's in the description. It's worth your time. But back to the father. When the archetype of the father manifests in a healthy way through the real father, it offers a foundation of firm but safe authority. It's the dad who guides without crushing, who corrects without shaming, who challenges without abandoning. He sets direction, defines limits, teaches values, and most importantly, he sees you. He looks you in the eye and says, even without words, you matter, you belong. But when that archetype fails, because the father was passive, violent, emotionally absent, or even idolized to an impossible degree, a fracture forms in the psyche. The child doesn't receive the push needed to confidently face the world. Instead, they grow up insecure, divided, often stuck in a lifelong waiting room for a validation that never came. That absence can't be filled with gifts, physical presence, or blind authority. It's emotional. And when that's missing, the father archetype gets distorted. It becomes unreachable. And what should be a source of structure turns into something that paralyzes. Jung said that every person eventually needs to break from the image of the father, meaning to move beyond his internal influence to become whole. But when that father was never truly present to begin with, what breaks instead is the ability to trust. And what we end up seeking isn't freedom, it's belonging. A belonging that, because it wasn't given, becomes something we chase in every decision. This search for belonging, which begins in childhood, doesn't just fade with time. It changes shape, changes scenery, but stays alive, operating in the background of adult life like an invisible engine. Most don't notice it, but that deep exhaustion you feel, the endless drive to prove yourself, the struggle to just relax, often traces back to emotional roots planted in the absence of a father who never affirmed your worth. The child who wasn't seen becomes the adult who tries to be perfect, who seeks validation through titles, performance, productivity, who turns work into a battlefield just to prove they deserve a seat at the table. But no matter how much they achieve, it always feels like something's missing, like there's a debt that can never quite be paid. Jung shows us that the father wound doesn't vanish with time. It settles into the structure of the ego and becomes a lens, a filter that distorts how you see yourself and the world around you. The adult shaped by this absence often lives in a constant state of tension, as if love has to be earned every single day, as if one mistake might bring back the disapproving gaze of a father who never really saw them to begin with. That's the mechanism behind self-sabotage. Not a personality flaw, but the echo of a wound. Deep down, there's a part that doesn't believe it deserves, that feels guilty for receiving, that can't stay in success, love, or the spotlight, because those moments trigger the same discomfort once tied to the father's gaze. Demanding, impatient, critical, or worse, non-existent. Many carry that discomfort as if it's just who they are. They say things like, "I'm just anxious," "I hate being the center of attention," or "I can't trust people." But these aren't personality traits. They're emotional memories dressed up as identities. They're defense mechanisms, built to survive a kind of pain that still lingers. The pain of growing up without a mirror to reflect a clear image of who you are. Without a father as external validation, the child tries to build internal validation on their own. But without a model, without direction, that process is almost always incomplete. The result is an adult who functions well on the outside, but is exhausted on the inside, who carries life on their shoulders, but fears it could all fall apart at any moment. That insecurity you carry, it's not weakness, it's survival. It's emotional intelligence that learned early on that affection was unstable, and that worth had to be earned. But the same strategy that once kept you safe is now keeping you stuck, and recognizing that is the first step toward breaking the cycle. Not all wounds bleed the same. Some ache in silence, others scream in memories, but both leave marks. And when it comes to the father wound, it's crucial to understand that it can show up in two very different, but equally deep ways. There's the active wound, the kind you can clearly identify. The father who was openly aggressive, violent, or instilled fear instead of safety. Harsh criticism, humiliation, total absence of affection, constant comparisons. These are what many would call obvious traumas. They leave sharp, specific memories, words that echo, silences that cut. The child grows up knowing something wasn't right, even if no one ever said it out loud. But then there's the subtle wound, just as painful. This one appears when the father was physically present, fulfilled his social role, but was emotionally distant. He provided, but didn't listen. Set rules, but withheld affection. He was there, but his heart was always somewhere else. And it's in this kind of relationship that many children learn not to expect, not to ask, not to feel. They adapt to the bare minimum, believing it's all they'll ever get. That subtlety is dangerous because it confuses. The child can't make sense of why they feel so distant from someone who, technically, didn't do anything wrong. And because there's no visible scar, they start to doubt their own pain. They grow up thinking that missing something invisible makes them ungrateful. That needing connection is a weakness. And so they shape an identity that doesn't acknowledge the wound, just hides it. Both forms, the active and the subtle, lead to the same outcome: a fractured sense of self, an identity built around absence, around unmet expectations, around the constant need to morph in order to be accepted. Jung reminded us that a child, faced with a wounding or absent father, doesn't blame the father. They blame themselves. They conclude, in silence, "If he didn't see me, maybe I'm not worth seeing." And that thought eventually turns into chronic insecurity, fear of speaking up, and shame about being fully seen. Because the father wound doesn't just whisper, "I lacked love." It screams, "I lacked recognition, and I learned to live without it." But living without being seen is exhausting. And eventually, the psyche can't keep pretending it doesn't hurt. When pain can't be named, the psyche finds a way to survive. One of the most common paths is to deny the need entirely. The child learns. Asking for love gets you nowhere. Showing vulnerability changes nothing. Seeking attention only ends in disappointment. So they start to give up, not on others, but on themselves. They stop expecting, stop expressing, stop needing. They build a kind of independence that looks like strength from the outside, but inside, it's self-abandonment. That child becomes the adult who never asks for help, who handles everything alone, who doesn't allow themselves to crack, who learned to endure but forgot how to receive. Autonomy becomes armor, productivity becomes a hiding place, emotional detachment becomes a shield against the pain of once being ignored. Jung said the ego forms through adaptation, and when the environment demands denial, the ego survives by sacrificing vital parts. Emotion pulls back, the body tightens, spontaneity vanishes. all in the name of keeping the system running. But at what cost? Many adults who pride themselves on being strong, logical, or self-reliant are actually carrying a child inside who learned that feeling is dangerous, that showing pain means losing value, that needing love is too big a risk. So they construct flawless personas, versions of themselves that work in the world, but are lost on the inside. And that disconnection takes a toll, because the more you deny what you feel, the further you drift from who you are. And the more disconnected you are, the harder it is to feel real. That's why even in success, there can be a void. Even surrounded by people, there can be loneliness. Even in constant motion, there's a tiredness that never goes away. This loss of contact with your own center doesn't happen overnight. It's gradual. It starts when needs go unmet. It grows when silence becomes the norm. And it locks in when someone believes that not feeling is a sign of strength, when it's really just another way of staying unseen. Over time, that disconnection turns into a lifestyle. What began as a childhood defense becomes a full-blown personality. The person starts to believe they're naturally closed off, naturally in control, naturally detached. But behind that armor still lives the same child who learned not to need, and because of that, still doesn't know how to receive. And society often rewards this adaptation: extreme productivity, laser focus, relentless self-sufficiency, traits that get praised, reinforcing the persona. Every time someone says, "How do you manage it all?" a little piece of that old pain retreats, but only for a moment. Jung said that what remains unconscious becomes fate, and often, the fate of these defenses is isolation. The person who controls everything, who doesn't allow mistakes, who avoids deep connections, doesn't do it out of coldness. They do it out of fear. Fear of opening up and being hurt again. Fear of loving and not being loved back. Fear of being seen and overlooked once more. Emotional distance, over-intellectualizing, the need to control everything. These are all ways of avoiding the original pain. But in avoiding pain, we also avoid intimacy, vulnerability, love. Eventually, what protected you becomes a prison. Life turns into a minefield where every emotion is a threat, where feeling too much is weakness, where needing someone is dangerous. "I don't need anyone" is often the most honest and most deceptive sentence someone can say. Honest because that's exactly what they learned, that needing others is too much. Deceptive because no one was born to live disconnected. And the deeper that belief takes root, the harder it is to break the cycle. Because the pain hides behind behaviors that seem normal, even admirable. But behind the success, the performance, the efficiency, there's still someone who was never truly comforted. Someone who learned to handle it all, but deep down just wants to collapse into someone's arms without having to earn it first. When that unheld child grows up, they carry their defenses into every space, including relationships. What looks like choice or compatibility is often just repetition. Unconscious repetition of an emotional pattern that never got resolved. The father wound doesn't just shape how you see yourself, it shapes how you connect. It's common for those affected by this wound to choose partners who replicate the same emotional absence. They're drawn to people who are unavailable, emotionally distant, critical, unpredictable. Not because they want pain, but because pain feels familiar. Jung called this symbolic repetition compulsion. It's the pull to return to the original wound, hoping this time for a different ending, hoping maybe now the love will come, hoping maybe now the gaze will arrive, hoping maybe now someone will say what the father never did: "You are enough." That's why so many relationships turn into validation loops instead of safe connections. They stop being about love and become about proving something. The person doesn't just want to be loved, they want to be recognized. They want the other person to fulfill the promise the father broke. But that desire comes with pressure, insecurity, and fear. And over time, it suffocates. Because no partner can carry the weight of healing a wound they didn't cause. The more you expect others to give what you never got in childhood, the more disappointment grows. The more the pain repeats. The more the relationship breaks down. What started as a search for love becomes a cycle of self-sabotage. Need turns into demand. Pain becomes control. Fear creates distance. And love, instead of being a bridge, becomes a test. A never-ending test of worth that no one ever passes. Recognizing this pattern isn't something to feel guilty about. It's clarity. Because as long as you love from the wound, you'll keep hoping someone else will fix something only you can heal. Loving with awareness means realizing, I'm not that child anymore. And what I didn't receive, I can now learn to give, to myself, before anyone else. Even after understanding the wound, reactions can still sneak in, because some of that pain doesn't live in logic. It lives in the unconscious. And in the unconscious, time stands still. Jung called it the father complex, a cluster of emotional patterns centered not around the actual father, but around the psychic imprint he left. This complex acts like an emotional magnet. It gets triggered in certain situations, and suddenly you're reacting like a child again. Even if you're 30, 40, 60 years old, it's that moment when someone challenges you, and you shrink. You feel small, powerless, ashamed, and you're not even sure why. Or when a harmless critique sparks an outsized rage. Or on the flip side, a silence that leaves you frozen. These reactions aren't about now. They're echoes, emotional circuits wired long ago, when you had no way to protect yourself. The father complex hijacks the adult self and replaces it with the wounded child, the one still chasing approval, still afraid of rejection, still hurting from authority or indifference. And the worst part? While it operates in the dark, you'll keep reacting instead of choosing. It's like stepping into a scene where the script was written years ago, and only realizing you're performing once the meltdown begins. A boss's tone, a partner's voice, a dominant male presence. Any of these can be triggers, and then you blame yourself for not handling it better. But it's not about control. It's about an unconscious pattern still running the show. The key is to notice these moments, with curiosity, not shame, because the complex doesn't need to be destroyed. It needs to be seen. And when you realize you're reacting to old pain in a new moment, something in you returns to the present. And with that comes choice. But the father wound doesn't just affect your outward reactions. Sometimes, the harshest damage happens within, not in your father's words, but in the voice he left behind. That inner voice doesn't yell. It whispers, "You didn't do enough. There's always something missing. Don't even try. You'll mess it up. You don't deserve rest, joy, recognition." It sounds like responsibility, like perfectionism, like high standards, but it's fear. Fear of failure, fear of not being worthy, fear of rejection. Again, Jung described this as one of the cruelest effects of the shadow. When a powerful figure, like a father, wounds or fails you, the child's psyche can't handle the idea that this authority figure was wrong. So, to maintain emotional order, the child turns the failure inward. If he didn't love me, something must be wrong with me. If he didn't see me, maybe I'm invisible. If he didn't approve, I must not be good enough. This thought, repeated in silence for years, becomes belief. That belief becomes identity. You end up living under the weight of an inner tribunal, where you're the defendant, the judge, and the executioner, always owing, always not enough. And the cruelest part? That inner voice doesn't feel foreign. It feels like you. But it's not you. It's a psychic inheritance. A recording so old it's mistaken for truth. Healing that voice doesn't mean silencing it by force. It means slowly replacing it with something more real. A presence that can hold you without demanding perfection, that can guide without punishment, that can affirm without crushing. That presence doesn't come from outside. It's born when you begin treating yourself with the respect you never received, when you stop being your own enemy and become the adult you always needed to find. For women, this critical inner voice sometimes takes on the shape of a wounded animus. The internalized masculine image Jung said lives within every woman's psyche. It becomes a ruthless inner authority demanding perfection, strength, competence, and control. It mirrors a father who was cold, demanding, or emotionally absent, or the idealized fantasy of one who never showed up. And when that happens, a woman distances herself from feeling, from intuition, from softness, because she learns she had to be hard to be valued. For men, the father wound often hits the core of identity. The father was supposed to be the first mirror of healthy masculinity, a reference of balanced strength, grounded presence, and emotional courage. But when that mirror was cracked, or missing, the result is often a man divided, confident on the outside, but empty on the inside, forever afraid someone will see through the mask and find out he's not enough. Some people become hyper-competitive, obsessed with control, always needing to prove something. Others withdraw from life, avoid conflict, shrink themselves, as if still waiting for permission to fully exist. In both cases, the authentic self gets buried under a mask, not shaped by the desire to be, but by the need to compensate. Jung shows us that archetypes like the animus aren't inherently problems. They're sources of power, but when they're wounded, they work against the psyche. Healing that wound means beginning to transform this internal authority into an ally. It means creating a masculine presence within that protects instead of punishes, affirms without dominating, and guides without crushing. Whether you're a man or a woman, this healing reorganizes the foundation of your identity. And with it, the world stops being something you have to defend against, and becomes a place where you can actually live as yourself. When that inner structure is built on absence, life becomes a long attempt to make up for what was missing. Without even realizing it, a person enters into an endless pursuit, not for ordinary recognition, but for that one specific gaze they never received, the gaze of a father. That search seeps into every area of life, career choices, relationships, lifestyle. Everything can become a quiet campaign to prove something, that you're capable, worthy, respectable. It's like there's a stage set up in your mind, and someone sitting in the front row, judging your performance. Only that someone might not even be around anymore, or maybe they never truly were, and yet their role is still active inside your psyche. Jung said that as long as a complex remains unconscious, it runs your life from behind the scenes, and the need to be seen becomes the fuel behind every action, even the most self-destructive ones. This is how the burnout cycle begins. You never truly rest, because everything you do carries the weight of trying to rewrite an old story. Even your victories lose flavor, because they're not really celebrations. They're attempts to fill the hole left by an inner father who never said, "I'm proud of you." And maybe the hardest part is realizing that no achievement can rewrite the past. No success can undo a childhood. No external validation can replace the love that never came. Trying to make that happen just keeps you chained to a time that's already gone. Trying to reclaim something that never existed the way you needed it to. But there is a turning point. A moment when you can stop and say, I don't need that approval anymore. Because I've grown. Because now I can look at myself and validate who I am. When that awareness is born, everything shifts. The world stops being a courtroom and becomes fertile ground. A space for expression, not judgment. For presence, not performance. Healing the father wound begins with a simple, powerful gesture. Naming the pain. As long as it goes unacknowledged, it continues to operate in the background, shaping your relationships, your self-esteem, your choices. And maybe until now, you've tried to avoid touching that pain. But denial doesn't heal. It only prolongs. You have to say it honestly. It hurt. Something was missing, and it still affects me. That recognition creates space for something most people try to avoid. Feeling the anger, the abandonment, the grief for everything that never arrived. Not as drama, but as liberation. Because what you don't feel, you repeat. But healing doesn't stop there. After naming and feeling comes the most important step, transformation. And transforming doesn't mean waiting for your father to change, or expecting others to fill that void. It means stepping into the role of the adult who can care for themselves. Jung said that one day, we must become our own parents. That means building inside ourselves the presence that was missing. A presence that is firm and loving, one that guides without punishing. It begins when you start treating yourself with respect. When you say no to what hurts you. When you stop abandoning yourself. That inner father shows up in the smallest moments. In the way you talk to yourself. In the boundaries you set. In the conscious decision to stop chasing approval. And that's exactly why what I'm about to suggest works so deeply. This exercise is widely used by therapists, psychologists, and in family constellations work. Writing a letter to your father. It's the same process we use to heal the mother wound. But this time, the letter is addressed to your dad. The exercise is simple. Write a letter to your father. But it's not meant to be nice, or logical, or polished. It's not a letter for him to read. It's a letter for you, to release. Write everything you never got to say. The pain, the anger, the absence, the frustration, the longing, the resentment, the confusion, the silence. What you felt when he didn't see you. What you wished he would have said, and never did. The times you tried to please, to shrink yourself, to disappear, just to be noticed. Don't worry about structure or clarity. Just let it out. If you need to curse, do it. If you need to cry, cry. If you get stuck, keep going. This letter is your safe space to truly listen to yourself. Maybe for the first time. When you're done, read it out loud. If you can, look into your own eyes in the mirror as you read. Let the words move through you, not to relive the pain, but to finally release it. And then, thank him for what was possible, for what wasn't, but still brought you here. And burn the letter. For real. Turn that moment into a ritual. You're saying, with that act, I'm done waiting. I'm done carrying. I'm letting go. Now, from my heart to yours, do it. But do it for real. I say this from experience, because just like you, I had my wounds. With my mom, they were subtle, hard to name at first. But with my dad, it ran deeper, an absence that looked invisible, but cut right through me. For a long time I kept going. I rationalized. I functioned. Until the day I wrote my letter. I didn't know what would come out. I started with no plan. But after the first line, everything poured out. Memories, unspoken words, scenes I thought I'd forgotten. And with them came answers. Connections I'd never made. In that moment, I understood why I loved the way I did. Why I was so hard on myself. Why I couldn't rest without guilt. And it was right there, that I began to change. That letter became a doorway of pain, but also of freedom. So please, write yours. And if you want, come back and share it in the comments. Because maybe what you write could be the spark someone else needs to begin their healing too. Besides the letter, there are other practices that can support your inner healing. One of them is therapeutic writing, directed to your inner child. Picture yourself today, standing in front of yourself as a child. What did they need to hear, but never did? What would you have said to them if someone had just given you the words? Write it all down, and if you can, read it aloud. This begins to reshape how you see yourself, from the inside out. Another powerful practice is the empty chair exercise. Sit across from an empty chair and imagine your father sitting there. Say what's been buried for years. Speak your truth. If it feels right, respond as if you were him. Not to create a logical dialogue, but to let the emotion move through your body and out. There are deeper techniques, like Jung's active imagination. In these you engage directly with parts of your psyche. The wounded child, the image of the father, the critical voice that's haunted you. These inner encounters can open some of the most honest paths inside you. Slowly, you begin treating yourself with more respect. You learn to say enough when it's needed, and you start to understand that caring for yourself is your responsibility, and also an act of love. If you want to take this process further with more structure, I've put together something special. A 21-day guided ebook with practices inspired by the teachings of Carl Jung. They're small steps, but each one can help bring you back to yourself. The link is pinned in the first comment. If it resonates, download it and start today. When that presence begins to settle inside you, something shifts. Quietly, but for good. The world, which once felt like a courtroom, starts to feel like a space where you can finally breathe. Life, which used to feel like a string of tests, becomes a journey of expression. And for the first time, you feel like you can simply exist, without having to constantly prove you deserve to. That's what healing the father wound really is. It's stepping out of the battlefield. It's letting go of the defense mode. It's stopping the projection of your worth onto someone else's gaze. Because in the end, the father wound wasn't just about your dad. It was about how you learned to see yourself through him. And when that reflection changes, your entire inner landscape begins to shift. You realize you no longer have to keep running. You don't have to be the strongest, the smartest, the most productive. You're not chasing an invisible trophy anymore, or dodging a judgment that was never truly yours. You're finally stepping into who you are, without the filter of pain. And that brings a kind of freedom that doesn't depend on applause. A peace that isn't broken by mistakes. A strength that doesn't have to harden to survive. It's a strength that rises from within, that is born from reconnecting with your essence, after years of living in the shadow of what was missing. Jung called this the return to the center, a movement that brings you back from the outskirts of a wounded ego, and reconnects you with the self, the deepest and truest part of your being. It's not about becoming some ideal version of yourself. It's about shedding the version you built to survive, and becoming, honestly, imperfectly, wholly, you. When that happens, love stops being a search, and becomes an expression. You no longer love to fill a void. You love because there is something inside you that overflows, and that overflow is what finally reconciles you with life. Because where there was once a void, now there is presence. Where there was fear, Now trust begins to take root. Maybe you've spent your whole life trying to be seen, trying to get it right, to please, to fit into a space that was never built for you. But maybe, just maybe, something is starting to shift. Because when you recognize the wound, without guilt, without denial, it stops running the show from the shadows. And when you give yourself the care you spent a lifetime searching for in someone else's eyes, the cycle finally begins to break. What used to be a constant chase for validation can now become a quiet act of self-love, not as a concept, but as a daily practice, as a real presence. You don't need to chase the love that never came anymore. You can stop, breathe, and choose, from this moment forward, how you want to relate to yourself, to others, to life. This isn't about forgetting what hurt. It's about giving that pain a new place, a place where it no longer writes your story, where you can look back with respect and look ahead with strength. If this spoke to something deep in you, leave a comment that says, "I choose to be free." That's how I'll know you stayed with me all the way through. And more than that, I'll know you're ready to take this next step with intention. And if this content helped you, and you'd like to support the channel, consider clicking the thanks button below. Even a small contribution makes a big difference and helps us keep spreading this message of healing to more people who need to feel seen and need to be set free. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening with an open heart. And thank you for being part of this space of transformation. I'll see you in the next video.